Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. We are 1 week into the Biden administration, and despite seeing many changes already taking place, including rejoining the Paris Agreement and the WHO, a very important piece of the puzzle remains to be seen, and that is the kind of relationship the Biden administration is going to try and forge with China, something our listeners have been asking a lot about, and something we at The Negotiation are also eager to find out. Fortunately, we were able to entice one of the sharpest minds on the subject to join us on the show, Mr. John Pomfret. John is a former Washington Post bureau chief in Beijing, the author of The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom, America and China from 1776 to the present, and has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. We couldn't ask for a more esteemed and well-respected guest to talk to us about the future of the America-China relationship, so let's get right to it. Enjoy.
I think that he's going to keep, for example, tariffs in place for a while. And he's not going to drop them unilaterally unless the Chinese give something, or at least are seen to be giving something. He has a lot of leverage because of the things Trump has done, that he can walk things back. But if he's smart, and I think he is, because he has Campbell in there, who I think is a relatively sage character, they're not going to give anything unless they get anything. Back to the idea that the relationship is going to be placed on a much more transactional basis, and that no one is going to be presenting the Chinese Communist Party with presence in hope of better behavior happening later on.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. John, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
We are thrilled and honored to have somebody with your breadth and depth of experience and knowledge on China on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to have such a close relationship and came to understand China so well?
Well, thank you. So I went to college on the West Coast of the United States with the goal of studying neurophysiology. And then I confronted college level chemistry. And at the same time, in that quarter, I also took a class on Chinese politics. And for some reason, I did a hell of a lot better on the class on Chinese politics than I did in first college level chemistry class I'd taken. I didn't know that you had to memorize things. And so based on that sense of this is actually pretty interesting and I'm doing pretty well at it, the professor kind of pulled me in. I took a whole bunch more classes related to China, to East Asia, anthropology, poli-sci, history, language. And in 1980, I found myself on the second group of American students who were studying in China. We'd normalized relations in 79. We'd had some students during the Cultural Revolution, but really not many. And I was off to the races. I spent 2 years in China there, first at the Beijing Language Institute and then in Nanjing, and really caught the China bug, if you will. At one point, traveling around China, I spent 55 days without speaking a word of English. And so I just really got into it. It was an amazing place. It was changing rapidly. And I returned to China in 88, 89 as a correspondent with the Associated Press. Covered Tiananmen Square, got kicked out after Tiananmen Square. My crimes were stealing state secrets and violating martial law provisions. But I still wanted to go back to China. And so in 1996, I joined the Washington Post. They sent me back. The Chinese agreed to let me come back in 97. And I was the bureau chief there from 97 to 2003. And then from 2011 to 2016, I lived in China again, got married to a Chinese woman, had kids in China, kids in the States as well. And we all went back to China in 2011 as she was running and still runs an adventure travel company in China called Wild China. So not only did my professional life really force me to engage with China, I engaged very deeply as a reporter, correspondent, bureau chief. Also, my personal life is, as the Chinese say, I'm a son-in-law of China. And so that engagement has been both, like I said, on a personal and professional life for my whole life, basically, since I was 20.
You have an incredible depth of not just knowledge, but empathy and touch points and familiarization with China on many, many different levels. Let's talk about the perception of China and the role that it's had in the world, how that's dramatically shifted over the last 4 or 5 years. Where would you attribute that coming from or propagating? Is it the PRC's behavior? Does it have anything to do with the Trump administration being in charge of the US? External factors like COVID or technology or Huawei's or AI? Where would you kind of attribute and start to talk about this shift in perception?
That question alone could probably have us talking for at least several days. I think the first factor is that China has changed significantly since 2012 when Xi Jinping took power. The change was already in the cards at the second administration of the Hu Jintao-Wen Jiabao duality, when Hu was the chairman of the party and Wen Jiabao was the premier. In that, the party recognized that the trajectory it was on was a trajectory that was probably going to lead to its losing power due to the fact that it had so much corruption, but also due to the fact that many people in the center of the party felt that China was becoming increasingly infected with ideas from the West. And when Xi Jinping took power in 2012, 2013, he galvanized the party first against Western thinking. He launched the most successful, if you will, crackdown against dissidents and human rights lawyers. He launched a massive crackdown on what he believed would be terrorist ideas, even in Xinjiang province. And then he increasingly accelerated a relatively aggressive foreign policy vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but specifically within China's neighborhood in terms of the South China Sea, pushing back against the Japanese, again, pushing back against the Indians. And so that, I think, is the major factor for how the world's views of China have begun to shift. In addition, in terms of economic relations with the rest of the world, he pushed an idea called Made in China 2025, which is actually, if you look at it, China's first push to decouple its reliance on the West in terms of Western technology, because it was basically a plan that would lay out for China how Chinese domestic industries would be able to substitute imports from previous Western companies that they've been reliant on. So they have a very aggressive program to replace chip manufacturing, et cetera. So I think the onus of the blame, if you will, for the changing views around the world of China and the increasing worry and concern that countries have about China really has to be placed at Xi Jinping's doorstep. That said, you also see in the West, due to the fact of the rise of populism, not simply in the United States, but also in Europe, a real worry about whether Western liberal democracy can cope with the challenges of postmodern living in around the world, and that so many people were left behind by globalism. And the issue then is how to construct a successful political system. And when you have China then with its continued economic success posing itself as an alternative, that has increased the concern that Western liberal democracy can't stand up to the challenges of the future, and that China can. And a perfect example of that would be how China's dealt with COVID versus the abject failure, at least in the United States, but also in Europe as well, Western Europe as well, of the governments of those areas and those countries to deal with the challenge of COVID. And COVID is a perfect example that the Chinese are saying, look, our system has been successful. Say what you will about the lack of individual freedom, but we're protecting lives. You Americans have lost 400,000 plus people. In China, not like we're barely touching 10, 15, 20,000. And so I think those two things combined with each other, the hard turn under Xi Jinping, coupled with our failures in our societies to deal with a lot of our problems, has made our views of China much harder than they used to be.
It seems like China and America, China is saying we don't need your technology. America is starting to say we don't need your manufacturing. Both places are taking their ball and going home. Where do we think this is going to land our relationships between the two once they do start to get comfortable in their new skins of, adopting more manufacturing, adopting more technology? Where do you see this relationship ending up?
That's a really interesting question. If you look at, so Xi Jinping wrote this book called The Governance of China, which nobody has ever read. Sadly enough, actually, I read it. And it's filled with stultifyingly boring chapters, full chapters that are just like guaranteed to put you to sleep. But one of the interesting things with the book is that the United States doesn't figure in his book at all. In fact, I think Zambia is mentioned more than America is. And I think that in and of itself is really fascinating. The Chinese Communist Party would like to deal with a world in which America is irrelevant. The reality is, though, it can't. And even in terms of technology, it's going to be a right long while, as my Southern grandmother used to say, before China has any way, shape, or form, any potential of being independent of the United States for technology, specifically high-level chip technology. At the same time, the United States is not going to be able to bring manufacturing back to America like we used to, right? And generally speaking, most of those jobs, if you're looking at furniture along the eastern seaboard, if you're looking for all sorts of types of construction, literally even into the spare parts for automobiles, China is going to be the one probably that's going to be doing it in the future. And so the idea that decoupling on a massive scale is going to happen is just a non-starter. The issue is how to remake the relationship at this, while you also have an understanding that it's going to be increasingly difficult and the competition is going to be increasingly fervent between the two systems and the two economies. And I think that Trump started the conversation in his own shambolic way, and Biden will continue the conversation as well. I think there, at least in Washington, there's been a fundamental shift on how China is viewed, partially because of our own problems with self-confidence, but also partially because of the direction that Xi Jinping has taken China in as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a combination of fear and a combination of anger and a combination of ignorance that all plays a part in what's happening. Were you potentially alluding to the fact that maybe the Biden administration may be closely tied to the Trump administration's take and attitude towards China?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be some similarities. I mean, for example, Kurt Campbell, who has been appointed as the Indo-Pacific coordinator in the administration, which is a new position, which actually puts him in some cases above the National Security Council in terms of a policy coordinator position, has written very sympathetically about the Trump administration's views of China, in that he has criticized the past, what he believes to be romanticization of America's relationship with China. And he has called for a far more transactional type of relationship. So he wrote a piece about a year ago with another China policy person by the name of Eli Ratner, which basically said, if the Democrats get into power, we're going to have a China policy that's going to be as tough on China, but is actually going to get things done because we're going to bring our allies along with us. And that's new and different from the Democrats, right? They previously had been, under Obama, embraced this idea that through deeper engagement, we were going to be able to help transform China into a country that embraced, to a certain extent, more Western ideas, such as a more liberal economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Campbell represents a significant break from that. And he's far closer to the Trump ideas of China than he is to the old ideas that were part of a long-time bipartisan consensus on China. So my guess on Biden is that he will not pursue a policy that we're not going to kind of return to the old days of U.S.-China pro-engagement policy with China. It's going to be far more hard-nosed, and it's going to be closer to the Trump policy than it was to the policies of Obama or the previous bipartisan consensus.
What do you think the top priorities from both sides are going to be over the next 4 years, as far as like sectors, industries, policy changes, even militarily? What do you think are going to be the focuses going forward in the next 4 years?
So actually, I think the focus of the Biden administration is not going to be on China. And that's actually going to be in some ways kind of the China policy. It's going to be let China wait. By trying to get the American house in order, which is a Herculean task, mind you, but by trying to get the American house in order, Biden is going to follow the ideas of many people around him saying that we cannot really deal with China from a position of weakness. And the only way we're going to be able to get things done with China is if we come to China and approach to China from a position of relative strength. And so I think there's going to be a lot of effort. Whether he can do it or not, I think is a huge question, trying to deal with America's ills. And only then can we really embrace China or engage China full on. I think that he's going to keep, for example, tariffs in place for a while. And he's not going to drop them unilaterally unless the Chinese give something, or at least are seen to be giving something. He has a lot of leverage because of the things Trump has done that he can walk things back. But if he's smart, and I think he is, because he has Campbell in there, who I think is a relatively sage character, they're not going to give anything unless they get anything. Back to the idea that the relationship is going to be placed on a much more transactional basis, and that no one is going to be presenting to China, the Chinese Communist Party, with presence in hope of better behavior happening later on. Now, this all could get blown out of the water by, for example, another nuclear test by Kim Jong-un, right? That could be highly possible. And, a series of, Asia-related crises could happen, and then we're off to the races. But I think assuming some type of relatively quiescent situation in Asia, the U.S.-China relationship is not going to be a priority of the Biden administration in any way, shape, or form. And it only will become important once Biden can really concretize his position as a relatively successful president in the first 2 years. That's sort of my guess.
Maybe it would behoove both sides to focus on cleaning up their own house first.
I think you're absolutely right. And I also think the Chinese are already trying to show some signs to the Biden administration that they're looking for a positive relationship. So we have the correspondence between Starbucks' former CEO, Howard Schultz, and Xi Jinping, in which Xi asked him to work on behalf of U.S.-China relations. There was a Xinhua news agency editorial that was unfortunately published on Christmas Day when nobody's looking, talking about we need a new Henry Kissinger between the two sides. So you have these smoke signals from Beijing saying we're interested. Also, the chief spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs quoted Elon Musk in a positive setting, saying, some foreigners who are really interested in China, really get us, and we appreciate their understanding. So these type of smoke signals have been traditionally used by the Communist Party to show that the American government, that they don't want to continue with this much more fractious relationship that we had under Donald Trump. And so my sense is, I agree with you completely. The Chinese are facing significant problems at home, in their in their neighborhood, and they want to see the United States, the relationship with the United States, to be at least to calm it vis-a-vis how it was over the last 4 years.
Yeah, I think we'd all like to see that relationship continue to be, at minimum, civil. How economically tied are China and the U.S.?
I mean, the trade continues to grow, actually. that's one of the things. I mean, you can have all these tariffs, but actually the reality is that China's trade surplus with the United States was breaking records over the last 4 years. I mean, the amount of business that continues to be conducted between the two sides is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And there's some relative optimism among American corporations who have a lot of their business activities in China about the future. You look at the Chinese economy, it grew at 2.2%, which is a hell of a lot better than us. And so if you look at China as a growth story, it still remains probably the biggest and best growth story in the world. And so that has a natural magnetic quality to that. So the business between the United States and China continues to be very positive for many American companies. That said, there are a lot of real issues vis-a-vis the theft of American technology, industrial espionage, et cetera, that continue to bedevil the relationship going forward. And finally, the United States Justice Department under the Trump administration took that issue seriously.
Let's talk a little bit about the multilateral institutions like Paris Climate Agreement, World Health Organization. The U.S. over the last 4 years was kind of committed to walking away from all of those. And, I'm curious, do you expect, President Biden to rejoin or to stay a part of those? And how do they work with China within those frameworks, within those meetings to be civil and accomplish some good things?
Well, I think clearly Paris Climate Agreement, the United States is going to walk back in. WHO as well. The Iran Accords, it looks like it's a possible. I would say possible to probable, but definitely on climate accord and definitely on the WHO. And it's going to be an interesting experience for the American diplomats who are going to be rejoining those organizations to deal with not only pressure, criticism, whatever from the Chinese side, but also pressure, criticism from the Western European partners who are really, who we should care about in many ways more because they're a much closer ally and their market is as massive, not as massive as China's, but large as well. So that's going to, and how the Biden administration plays that is going to be a fascinating process. Now, John Kerry knows the Chinese very well. In fact, he knew the Chinese very well when he was senator from Massachusetts. In fact, he gave the Chinese Costco, a large Chinese shipping company, a plaque for saving the port of Boston. So Kerry political trajectory was directly impacted in a positive way by Chinese investment in the United States. And he's now the climate czar, and he's going to be dealing with China on a regular basis, given that China is now the world's biggest CO2 emitter. And I think that relationship is going to be a relationship going forward. But as the rest of the world has acknowledged, we're only going to move the climate issue forward if America's on board. And so even though there's going to be criticism in the United States because, we blew them off for 4 years, there's also going to be a lot of people who are going to be welcoming us, specifically because a lot of hard negotiations are going to be undertaken with China, but also it's important to remember with India as well.
As we've seen, the U.S. got pretty strict with China. They wanted to try to dilute maybe the manufacturing prowess of China and the dependency upon it. Do you think China might be doing the same, where they want to push back on the U.S.'s tendency to militarily be somewhat assertive around the world, or even with currency be somewhat assertive around the world? Do you think China is taking a bit of a lead, and maybe for some other countries as well, trying to push back a little bit?
Well, I think that China is uncomfortable with an American-led global order, even though if you look around the world, the country that has benefited the most from the American-led global order has been China. The 50 some odd years of peace in East Asia have greatly benefited China, and that's a peace that's been effectively policed by the United States. So they view the United States both as a facilitator of their rise, but now they're ready to replace America. At least they think so. And so on many areas, they have, in some cases with Belt and Road, they've tried to create an alternative structure in terms of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to the Japanese/American-led Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. On currency, they're interested in a moneyless economy, and they have put a lot of effort in investments into digital currency as well. And they've also flirted with the idea of the internationalization of the renminbi as an alternative, again, to the dominance of the greenback. And then when we pulled out of the climate conference and also the WHO, they looked at that as an opportunity. And you see in the Chinese press, it's riddled with once in a 1,000-year opportunity on a variety of subjects. During the course of the Trump administration, as America became increasingly turned inward, you had the Chinese writing in policy journals saying this is a really big opportunity for us to increase our international influence as America turns more and more inward on a broad array of fronts, from technology to currency to WHO health policy to climate as well. And so they're very uncomfortable with an American-led system. The only problem is that the Chinese are uncomfortable with the American-led system, but they don't quite know how to lead themselves. And I think that's a huge challenge for them. Back to the original point that when we started our discussion about the hardening of the view on China, it's not simply a phenomenon of the United States. This is something that is shared in many places of the world, not simply in the developed world, but also in the developing world as well.
Yeah. Could you lean in on that a little bit more? First of all, thank you so much for saving my poorly framed question. I loved what you did with that. It was exactly what I wanted to actually get out of you. Can you lean in a little bit more on maybe what the rest of the world and how it's not just the U.S., that there are actually a lot of other parties around the world that we maybe don't know or hear about that are also in favor of a lot of the U.S. stance on things?
First, although Trump was pretty lousy at alliance management, to put it mildly, the Europeans are, Western Europeans in particular, but the Poles as well, Hungary not so much, definitely the Czechs, are concerned about China's influence far more than they used to be. And this is not something that was a result of American pressure. This is something that was kind of organic to their experience. In the past, the Germans used to be the rah-rah team for closer relations with China. And now you have the Germans coming to the United States for more information about how America manages CFIUS, which is the organization in the Treasury Department that looks at foreign investment in the United States, as a way to protect German companies, because for a while the Chinese were buying one German company a week. This was a few years ago, but nonetheless, the Germans have put a significant damper on China's ability to invest in Germany. So this is not something that's simply an obsession of the United States. You see it in your country as well, in Canada as well. But you're also beginning to see it in the developing world, which used to be the bastion of pro-China feeling. So even in Africa, which has been the beneficiary of a huge amount of Chinese investment, you have significant problems vis-a-vis the Chinese. In Pakistan as well, there have been terrorist attacks against Chinese investment projects there. So you have China being viewed in Pakistan as kind of a new America, given the close relationship the United States had with Pakistan for so long. So this is not simply, and then of course India, the Chinese have a significantly negative relationship with the Indian public. So, and now in some parts of the world, people love China, but even in those parts of the world, like for example, Brazil, which was having a very positive relation with China under previous administrations, the current administration is very anti-China. And now you have a situation where it's become a political football over what vaccine to use, whether it's the Pfizer, the Moderna vaccines, or the Chinese developed vaccine. And that's become a political football, and the Chinese clearly don't want to see that type of problem as well. So a lot of issues. And then the COVID problem kind of cuts both ways. Because on one side, you have a lot of respect for the Chinese for dealing with COVID so well. At the same time, there remains this residual resentment against China for not really failing, at least in the perception of a lot of people, to cope with the COVID problem in the beginning and to not share information about that as well. So I think it's a very complicated picture, but it's hardened over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. Added to that, if I may, the wolf warrior diplomacy of Chinese diplomats going around the world lecturing countries, lecturing Sweden, lecturing Canada, lecturing Germany, lecturing Poland. People are a bit fed up, lecturing South Africa as well. People are a bit fed up with that type of sort of the new bold Chinese diplomat who are clearly doing it in order to get brownie points in Beijing. But what's happening is in the societies in which they're living, Sweden, South Africa, Brazil, Canada, United States, it's negatively affecting China's public opinion and its soft power.
Do you think it's a general mistrust or distrust in the true intentions of the why China is trying to assert themselves? They're almost taking instead of being given the leadership roles. And this is at least causing most countries to, at minimum, raise an eyebrow.
Yeah, I think part of it is that. Part of it is also the way they are perceived to be playing international diplomacy. So look at Canada's problem, right? In the Huawei case. So the Huawei CFO is living in her house in Canada. She can see her relatives on the holidays. She has an ankle bracelet, and life can't be wonderful, but it has nothing to compare with what the two Michaels are suffering in China. You see the tit for tat problems with the Australians and the Chinese basically not liking Australia's attitude, so they blanketly punish Australian coal exporters and Australian vineyards because they don't like some things that the Australian government has said. That type of, you kind of cross me in one ways and then I'm going to double cross you in another just to punish you. That type of diplomatic game playing is not helping China's international image at all. And I think it's been very detrimental to them accomplishing their goals as a emerging power in the East.
Do you see an end to the tariff war, perhaps over the next 4 years through all this?
Yeah, I do see an end to the tariff war. But it's interesting if you look at the smoke signals, as I talked about earlier with Howard Schultz and Elon Musk even, and the editorial in Xinhua News Agency, there's no acknowledgement in those smoke signals that the Chinese have overreached. And I think that what one would hope to happen with the tariff wars is that the tariffs are released as China improves its behavior. And I think that in the White House, there's going to be very little interest in getting rid of the tariffs unless Chinese behavior actually changes. And I think the critical element will be whether China is willing to change its behavior. And I don't know whether it is or not, but I think it's willing to modify a bit. And there's also some areas where China can really help the United States. So for example, if Kim Jong-un goes off the rails again, you could actually see the United States being greatly benefited if China would change its relationship with North Korea. I don't know whether China is willing to do such because China views North Korea so differently than what we do in the West. But I think that there will be some crises that will potentially create an opportunity for China to modify its behavior that actually could refract well back on Beijing and improve U.S.-China relations. The question is whether the Chinese are willing to embrace those opportunities because they will come.
I think you're right. I think if we take the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and start to see a little bit more of that way you're not intrinsically buying into or befriending or adopting or being subservient to anybody else's whims, wishes, or political narratives whatsoever. But I think we've seen a lot of this even in the American politics right now, where there was a lot of people on the right who despise a lot of what the left stands for and may not have liked Trump, but he was the enemy of something that we hate, and therefore that makes him our candidate. I think maybe if we saw a little bit more of this, then, quietly they might be able to come closer together, at least in the eye and the public's opinion and view, which would make a lot of things much more comfortable for a lot of citizens who live in each other's countries and a lot of businesses who do business in each other's country.
Yeah, I agree. But I think also in many ways, the ball's in China's court. And the question is whether the PRC, the CCP have the desire to have an understanding that the policies that they've followed over the last half decade or more have actually not benefited China. They think, and the problem is the narrative in China says that they have benefited China, and I think that they haven't. And the issue is whether the voices that acknowledge that this wolf diplomacy and this increasingly aggressive moves in South China Sea, et cetera, have not served China's interests well, whether those voices can gain the upper hand. And I think it's an open question. But I think that it's interesting that the Chinese are sending the Biden administration smoke signals on this issue. And so we'll have to take it from there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the things to watch, I think, in the first quarter of Biden taking over the administration. That's going to be extremely interesting. A lot of focus is going to be, I think, on the COVID and kind of like the calming of the waters in the U.S., but very high up on the next in line on the docket has to be the China relations for sure.
Yeah. I wanted to get back to one more thing that you said previously about, I also think that in the West we have, and you probably know this very well from living in China, in the West we have a significant blind spot when it comes to, when we look at China, we have a tendency to underestimate the challenges that are facing the Communist Party of China in ruling China. I'm not talking about a revolution or anything like that. I'm just talking about China has a lot of problems, and it has significant problems just in the area of tech, where it's often perceived overseas to be the world leader in everything. And it's not. So you look at the coronavirus, it's vaccination. Its vaccine is probably the biggest Chinese vaccine is probably 50%. It does well on 50% of the cases. It will probably help people avoid getting a serious case of COVID, but not necessarily COVID as well. So because of it, COVID will continue to flourish if that's the only vaccine we have. You look at chip technology as well. They poured billions and billions of dollars into trying to be able to outcompete the United States in terms of chip technology. They have not succeeded. They have a serious demographic problem, which is one of the reasons why they put so much money into AI, because they're trying to increase productivity. But that's another issue. And as anyone who's lived in China knows, they have really, really serious environmental problems. And so one of the issues I think it's important to be cognizant of as we go forward is that in China, the graphs don't always go up. And we've become accustomed to them always going up in China. And they've done an incredible job of managing their economy during COVID. But the reality is that medium term, they have significant issues that are going to force them, like us in many ways, to keep a very serious focus of their attention on dealing with internal problems. And we need to be cognizant of that and to understand that they have pressures too. Not even to mention the political problem of having someone who's declared himself president for life. And at a certain point, not today or tomorrow, but at a certain point, he's going to become a tottering old man. And what happens then? Right. And so medium, long term, serious demographic problem, medium, long term, potential serious political problem, and medium, long term, significant technological issues, I think create a situation where China doesn't really want to have a majorly fractious relationship with the United States, which remains its most important economic partner, despite all this intense competition they're facing.
How is the Biden administration going to be able to work with China moving forward whilst keeping their constituents happy, given their freedom first ideals tend to oppose what they believe China's communist regime stands for?
That's a great question. one could argue, and I think and people do, is that the right-wing perception in the United States of freedom is a fundamentally flawed perception, flawed definition of what freedom is. I mean, basically your freedom to have a fist stops at my face. And the right-wing perception is that I can do whatever the hell I want to, regardless. And, I could even shout fire in a crowded movie theater, even though no one's going to be there because of COVID, but that's beside the point. But I think and I think what Biden is about is trying to return the United States back to the definition of freedom that we began to embrace, because it's a work in progress. It remains one, but we began to embrace with the founding fathers, is that we have freedom, but we also have responsibility. And I think the right-wing definition of freedom is freedom without responsibility. And I think that we need to, move back towards that, which is a more communal view of freedom. Whereas the Chinese would say, well, we can't trust the people. And so we will impose everything on the people and tell them what to do. And only that type of ordered society is a society that will be able to be powerful in the future. Whereas I think the American idea is that we are more empowered when we are free people who come together willingly and are both responsible and free. And I think that's just a fundamentally different view than what the PRC, the CCP have embraced. But underneath your question, I recognize the fact that ideologically there is a huge divide between how America should organize its society and how China does. That said, I don't think that stops the potential for significant, wonderful cross-pollination between the two countries and the two societies as well. And competition. I think the fact that China as a really different model for the world is a fascinating way to try to push America to get its act together as well. We do well when we have competition.
Ultimately, do you think the U.S. can escape the issue of the Thucydides trap with respect to China? For those unfamiliar with that term, it's used to describe an apparent tendency towards war when an emerging power threatens to displace an existing great power as the most dominant internationally. John, is there enough areas of cooperation and economic integration, or perhaps even some other factors, that will allow cooler heads to prevail?
I think that people make history. And so in many ways, it depends on who's going to be in charge of both our country and China. And then some of the third parties that also have a dog in this fight, if you will. So, for example, if you get a nutty president of Taiwan who goes off the deep end and pushes Taiwan to declare independence, even though de facto it's already independent, you could face real problems in terms of a conflict with China. I think that there is room enough in the world for both China and America to be and to prosper. I also think that with time, the arc of history in China will also move to a more just society. In many ways, I think Xi Jinping might be the last emperor, if you will. So yes, I think that there's more than potential to avoid the Thucydides trap. In fact, there's a lot of argument about whether actually it's a trap at all. So that's another issue, though. But I'm relatively optimistic that with sage leadership on both sides, you'll be able to manage a relationship that's going to be increasingly competitive, but also have a lot of areas where cooperation will exist as well. North Korea for me is a fascinating issue. And how it could actually help bring the two countries together. But right now, there's a huge deficit of strategic trust. And I think both sides need to work to rebuild it, not necessarily make it better, but at least stop the slide.
John, thanks so much for coming on the show today. How can people get in touch with you, follow, read your stuff, and talk a little bit about, the book, The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom that you've written? Tell us a little bit about what it's about and where people can also go and find that as well.
Oh, thanks a lot. You can follow me at JE Pomfret at Twitter. And The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom is a history of America's relations with China. from 1776 to the present. It starts obviously with the trading relationship, which was extremely important to the 13 colonies once they won independence from the United Kingdom, goes into the missionaries and how they continue to exert a huge influence over how Americans view China. Through the First World War, Second World War, when China was America's ally, goes into the whole history, the very difficult history of Chinese Americans in the United States, faced with an Exclusion Act, which would mark the first time that America ever excluded any people of any ethnicity from coming to America. Through the Nixon opening to China in the 1970s, the Obama relationship with China, and Trump as well. So it's called A Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom. It's an amazing story. And because I'm a journalist and not a historian, I really let the characters try to tell the story of the relationship. So the narrative is pretty spunky at times.
That sounds amazing. I would encourage everybody who's interested in China or not to go find that book and go read that book. I think we could all use a little bit more education around what culturally makes us all a little bit different. I think it would help actually bring us all a little closer together. John, thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Really, really fun to be with you. And best of luck to all you and your listeners as well.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。